Hello, welcome back. My name is Clor and I'm the artist behind the channel. This video is the second installment of my new project of narrated paintovers, so quick reminder of how it works. You send me your artwork and I spend 1 hour reviewing it and painting over it for a small fee. This way you get pointers on what to improve and how to get better to continue your art journey. All the info is being displayed on the screen right now, so feel free to check it out if you're curious. And to participate, just send me an email at artofclor@gmail.com with your artwork attached, and voila! Today we're painting over an artwork by NP Production 7. I think it's a fan art and crossover between Bloodborne and Dark Souls with the player characters of both games fighting. It's a pretty cool idea and it has a lot of potential to make really interesting combat poses and attack shots. I really like the split between the line-arted characters and a more painterly and lineless landscape, so I think that's a really good idea that can be expanded upon. I also see that the artist put a lot of attention into the attire's details. If you look at that cleaver weapon the hunter is holding, for instance, they even make all the intricate lines on the hilt and so on, so lots of research went into that to make sure everything was accurate, so I applaud that. Now, when the artist contacted me, they added a few comments about things they were struggling with, so let's quote them. My first problem is that I am not sure what I am doing. I'm trying to develop my own style without any parents, and I think I need to study on how to do shading. So, from the looks of it, the main issue of the video will be to explain how to transition from the basics into something more creative, kind of like a step up from the raw fundamentals into something more unique. So that process is not an easy task for sure, but perhaps we can unearth a few things to get the artist going in that direction. Before I start talking about style more in depth though, I want to make a few observations. So when looking at the artwork, the first element that jumps to my attention is that the characters are grey and monochrome, standing in front of an equally grey sky. Ideally, you want to avoid that or put a bit of contrast and variations of value between the two, so that the main subject, so here the characters, really pop out and are the first thing people see. So, checking the values here by turning the work into grayscales, we see two things. One, the sky and characters are really close in the value, so in shade of grey, and they don't stand out from each other. If I were to remove the line art, they would blend in almost entirely. And number two, there are no lighter shades of grey or white to make anything pop. So the values goes from mid-grey to black only, and it means there is an entire side of the spectre that can still be used to add some more contrast to the scene, so that's a good thing to keep in mind for later. Now, to make my workflow relatively easier, I'm going to isolate the characters on a new layer so that the background becomes separate. That's a lot of selecting and erasing, so let me speed this up for the magics of editing. Alright, all done. Now remember what we said in the intro. The artwork is supposed to show two characters fighting. That means tension, dynamic poses, and probably a lot of cross-shape compositions to show conflict and collision. So while the knight on the right shows movement since he's in the middle of an attack, the hunter on the left is a lot more static. So in order to show what I mean a bit better, I'm going to sketch their current poses and then sketch new, more dynamic poses on top to really highlight the difference. With the black lines, I'm trying to sketch a new pose for the hunter. While trying to keep the idea of the original pose, I'm changing it to make it more dynamic and hinting at movement. The legs are giving me trouble, so I'm trying different things until something sticks. The idea here is to get the legs to continue the movement of the chest and arms. The hunter is hoisting the weapon in the direction of the knight, so he needs balance and a strong hold onto the ground, but he also needs to be shown moving toward the knight. A foot under him for support sounds like a good option to me, with his other leg stepping forward. I'm also changing the knight's pose slightly to reinforce the angle posture and make his body point towards the hunter more. For that, I rotate him a bit and bring his folded leg inwards so that his limbs are all aiming in the same way instead of several. We'll see afterwards why it's important. Once I've done all that sketching, I'm just doing a quick secondary sketch to fix proportions and add the main muscles and joints. This will help understand the body's volume and 3D aspect later on, when it's time to draw clothes and other elements. Adding a central line running from the middle of the neck onto the chest and towards the crotch is also good to keep track of the body's general orientation. Now for the comparison. As you can see, the new poses are less static and more dynamic because they draw a cross between both characters, each of them going in a single direction and against the other. It shows them interacting and they are mirroring each other's moves, visibly about to meet or collide, so this perpendicular setup is really useful to show face-offs because you get to display two characters in mirror moving towards each other, implying immediate, hostile in this case, contact. In the old poses, the knight is pointing towards the hunter in an oblique line, but the hunter is not mirroring that, so they look disconnected. The hunter's body weight and gesture is pointing vertically, meaning he's much more stable and grounded and not in the process of attacking or going towards the other character. In turn, this does not show any interaction or looming threat. They're next to each other, but they are each doing their own thing, so to speak. So I'm fixing it that way. And as a side note, there are many more configurations than just the cross perpendicular setup, so feel free to Google or take inspiration from real life with combat pictures, for instance. I just went with this because it was suited to this project and required minimal distortion of the original. Okay, enough explanations. We got new poses, so let's try to align the characters with them. I'm trying to keep the edits to a minimum since I want to preserve the original art as much as possible, but considering the amount of tweaks I'm about to make, realigning and redoing are impossible to escape entirely. I'm working on the knight first. I moved the limbs and different elements around, and now I'm redoing some lines to smooth things out again. The angle and perspective in some clothing elements are a bit skewed, so it's time to fix that along the way. One thing to keep in mind is that you want your outfit to really follow the general gesture of the pose. So for instance, the chest plate can bend a little to follow along the outline of the torso more, instead of being a bulky mass that seems to weight the knight down. The central line done on the sketch is really useful here because you can use it to place the middle of the chest plate and have the central carving follow the curve of the torso underneath. The fur coat can also have more volume to reinforce the strong shoulders of the knight and make him look even more powerful while brandishing his sword. A big guy with broad shoulders sounds more threatening, so you can boost some shapes on purpose to achieve that effect. Same with the fabric elements. The cape can follow the motion of the attack and fly behind the character to highlight that he might be in the middle of his move, causing the cape to follow after him. Little details like that are not much, but they do a lot to sell the impression of movement. Okay, night is done, time to do the same thing with the hunter. I'm saving the weapon as I think it is really nicely done and doesn't need any editing, and I will focus on the character instead. So I'm adjusting the coat and clothes to follow along the new body orientation. His torso is turned to our left, whereas the legs are facing our right, so the clothes need to reflect that. Similarly, we're going to play with the long cape and coat to make it follow along the hunter's motion, as if the coat was being carried by the shuffle of air behind him. Again, important little elements to sell the idea of quick movement. I'm also keeping up with the light source, which is coming from the left from what I can see. There are some minor mistakes here and there, but the light direction is mostly all good, so there are no big changes to be done here. Sadly, I cannot get all the details back into the artwork in such a small amount of time. This paint over took more than 1 hour because of all the line art already, so even at max speed I couldn't squeeze all the neat little details back. Apologize for that. Lastly, I moved the weapon further down. It is now pointing directly at the knight's middle and oriented upwards. Because the hunter is positioned underneath the knight's strike, it makes sense for him to direct his attack upward to negate this disadvantage somewhat. This also serves to balance the pose, as the weapon acts as a counterweight to the hunter's dynamics, implying that he has to pull with all of his body to lift it up. This means the cleaver must be extra heavy and extra threatening. Now let's get into stylization a bit more, since it's the artist's main issue. They decided to keep the characters in grayscale with a strong line art, so to give them volume we have to rely on things other than detailed shading and color. What I'm doing here is highlighting the areas where light is the strongest, and darkening the areas where shadow is the strongest. To do that, I just make spots of brighter and darker grays on an overlay layer using a soft brush for the characters only. It keeps the shading to a minimum with just one shade of gray, but adds a bit of variation that looks like a blended gradient on top. It's really easy and quick to do because you can use a big brush size and be rough with it, not too precise. That's one way to detail your shading further without altering your style too much, and it's a real step up as it adds a lot of volume in my opinion. On a side note, I'm also moving the characters a bit more to the left of the canvas. The reason is, if they are a little bit off-centered, it adds to the impression of movement and dynamism. We can now move on to the background. As we say, the artist's style is a combo of detailed line-arted characters and low detailed background in a more painterly style. The idea here is to keep that setup but make the background a bit more structured. First we have to clean up the tree shapes a bit, so trees can be kept fairly simple with just a few branches that develop progressively across the trunk, but they still have to show some sort of structure from thick to thin, or they start looking too chaotic to be appealing. I also moved them around a bit to get rid of the ones behind the characters, as it looked like the branches were sprouting out of them. For the ground, a textured brush and a few shades of dark green and dark yellow can do the trick. You can complete it with a Strands type of brush to hint at grass. In order to follow the light source, I'm also placing the darkest area in the front and the brightest area towards the back behind the characters. Once we did that, let's get rid of that grey sky. I'm replacing it with a bluish ambience, but that's just one choice among many. The key here is to keep the grey for the characters only and give more color to the rest to keep things separate. Since the hill-shaped ground felt a bit too simple to me, I added another layer with more ground stretching further away using the same textured brush. I just made it progressively brighter until it disappears into the blue to hint that the forest continues behind them. Same thing with the trees, I am adding progressively brighter and smaller or thinner trees to show that the woods are continuing past the scene. Doing that is fairly simple and it really helps giving the background depth and a 3D aspect. Just keep in mind that the further away something is, the less detailed and contrasted it is going to be. Once all the main details are down, using the levels menu and some overlay layers to do light adjustments is always a good idea. This way you make sure the artwork is not underexposed or overexposed and that all the values are balanced and make sense. I'm keeping the background brighter than the characters so that the black and white characters remain the main focus by being more contrasted than the background. One last thing that can be done to tie the artwork together is to use the color balance menu. Once the background is done, you can go back, to the character and slightly change the hue of their layer to account for ambient light and color. So here, instead of being pure gray, black, white, the colors are altered so that the shadows have a hint of blue in them and the highlights a hint of yellow. Just a hint, nothing too obvious, but just enough to color the gray a tiny bit. It helps give the impression they're inside the environment and affected by it more than pasted onto it. This is especially important as they are drawn using a different style. Are we done? Oh no, not quite. We forgot two little fellas. The artist added two little stick figures having a fight, and it would be criminal to remove them, so I'm just going to move them closer to the center so that they are more in frame and further away from the edge. Having a detail of importance so close to the edge is never a good idea, as it makes the whole thing look like a bad crop. Now removing some saturation so that the blue hair doesn't detract from the main focal point, and we are done. That was long, but we made it to the end. Thanks to NP Production 7 for submitting this artwork. I hope this narrated paintover is going to help you on your art journey. I really like the combo of two vastly different styles, and I'd love to see more of it in the future. This video will hopefully give you a few tips and ideas on how to elaborate in each department and blend both together a bit better. As always, I'm on the lookout for art to paint over, so if you want to have your artwork reviewed as well, please send me an email at artofclor@gmail.com. All the info can be found in the description box below. Thanks for watching and see you next time.